We turn now to migration. Ministers from France and Germany, Belgium and the Netherlands are meeting in Calais this lunchtime, as we know, to discuss what's happening in the English Channel after that awful tragedy of the 27 deaths at sea last week, which electrified the question once again. Now, the talks are taking place, as we know, without a minister from the UK, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, having been taken off the list by France, furious at the way Boris Johnson conducted negotiations on the question with that public letter last week to President Macron. Diplomatic relations between countries are always on a seesaw, of course, by their very nature, sometimes evenly balanced, sometimes skewed upwards or downwards. This time, the tilt is clearly downwards. Now, is that just a break in the weather, a temporary storm that's going to pass, or something with longer consequences? I've been talking to Sir Ivan Rogers, who you'll remember was the UK's permanent representative to the EU, the ambassador, until he resigned at the height of the Brexit negotiations in 2017. So I asked him to use a barometer on this one. How deep a depression are we in?
Well, on the barometer, I think this one is really pretty low pressure, by which I mean it's pretty bad and pretty sustained. I think this is not just a single spat. I think it's multiple spats, and it reflects a deep underlying mistrust between the two sides.
In other words, it's not simply a question of that letter having popped up on Twitter rather earlier than President Macron would have wished. It's something that goes wider.
I think the letter it's a curious thing to do if you want to make serious progress. Imagine there'd been some, horrendous incident on the Gibraltar-Spain border and the Spanish Prime Minister had written a public letter and stuck it on the front of El País. What would the reaction in London have been, especially if that letter contained multiple propositions that the French had previously rejected? You would think this isn't really a very serious gambit about trying to get somewhere different and appreciating the gravity of the situation. This is about maximising support at home for saying this is a problem fundamentally caused by French intransigence. So it was not likely to get anything other than the reaction it did, I think.
You talk about a more general malaise in relationships. How would you characterise it?
I think it's been exacerbated, obviously, by all the tensions over Brexit. There's a perception that this British government goes back on its word. It's prepared to sign off treaties and then find ways unilaterally to override provisions that it proves not to like in practice. I think that's become a real fundamental problem. And at the moment, there seem to me very few private conduits where real business can get done.
It's interesting you say that because you had difficulties with Theresa May. You ended up leaving government civil service in 2017. But even then, I think you felt, although you had reservations about the negotiating strategy, that there was a relationship that she was pursuing personally with other leaders as a sort of back channel.
Oh, yes, and that was very true of her as Home Secretary, incidentally. She dealt very capably and very regularly with German and French opposite numbers in particular. The personal relationships were rather stronger then.
The question is how this will matter in the future. Will it have consequences for what we tend to call the national interest going forward?
I think so, unless you resolve it. If we turn this into the bilateral relationship, it's a broader issue than that. But on France and the UK, we're broadly similar-sized powers. I think we do need a new treaty with the French. We need a deeper foreign policy relationship with the whole of the European Union. And where they're not with us, we need a serious way of trying to resolve disputes without them all blowing up into massive trade wars.
Clearly, the French decision to remove Priti Patel from the guest list for today's meeting, which is going on in Calais, was a deliberate statement of irritation. How do you think about the discussions that took place before the Prime Minister's letter? Why did he decide to go about it that way, with all the risks of the consequences that we've now seen?
If there'd been a constructive and serious discussion between the two main men on the Wednesday, why do you then publish a letter later on that night and put it out on Twitter before the French president has even had a chance to read it? I mean, seriously, no one who knows anything about the conduct of international affairs would have expected a good reaction from the French. I think it's unfortunate to disinvite Priti Patel. In the end, these are incredibly difficult, complex issues. They affect everybody on both sides of the channel. So in the end, there has to be a dialogue with Priti Patel with opposite numbers in France. We're not even outliers on the scale of the problem. France and Germany take appreciably more asylum seekers per year than we do at the moment and are under just as much pressure. So it's not that we're facing this problem alone and facing an enormous crisis that others aren't facing. This is a common crisis. In the end, we have to find effective ways to work together on it.
Ivan Rogers. This week's producers, Alex Ritchie, Deryl Starr, Sophia Hollis, the editor, Frankie Toby. This is James Naughtie, and that was The World This Weekend.